Okay. Hi everyone, this is SmithyQ from SmithyQ.com, and here today is going to be part 2 on my series on the center, on the importance of the center in chess. My first video, I discussed how using your pawns and advancing them in the center, advancing your pieces in the center, can often give you a space advantage. And then I illustrated how some examples of how a space advantage, specifically with those pawns, can give you a devastating advantage. But then, of course, there's the sort of logical follow-up, is that there are certain openings, like this, the King's Indian, in which white will end up with a space advantage. He already has a space advantage. He has 3 pawns in the center, controls all these squares, and yet, very often, it is black who is the one who has the better pieces, and black is the one who is doing the crushing. And so, well, the question is, why is that? Why does this hypermodern strategy work here, where black allows white to take the center? How does that work here, and why does it not work in other situations? Why does it work? What are the principles behind it? And so here today, I would like to look at this. I would like to explain that. First, I'm going to look at it a bit more in general. Then I'm going to look at it in specific, and then I'll get detailed game examples. The first thing I want to look at here is just the nature of pawns in the center. So if we look at the standard King's Indian pawn structure, where white gets these 3 pawns, and if we look at that, what makes these pawns so strong is that they control a disproportionate amount of the board, right? They're controlling all of these squares right here. And they're also threatening to advance. But there is one problem with advancing pawns. If you look at this, we can see all these squares are protected. If one of the pawns were to advance, for example d5, then all of a sudden things are different. Now only these 4 squares are actually protected. d5 is as well, but these 4 are the main ones. We back up. 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 5. Here we've got 4. So by advancing one pawn by itself, we're actually losing control of certain squares. Indeed, if we look at this, because all the pawns are on white squares, this means that these dark squares are all weak. This square is potentially weak as well. If these pawns are stuck like this, if these pawns cannot move, then these squares are essentially weak forever. The main advantage, if we back up, of this pawn center, is that they can advance, is that they could expand, that we can start moving like this, and you could just mow down all the pieces in front of you. That's the advantage. If the pawns cannot move, if they are stuck, if they are static, then they have lost much of their advantage. In fact, they've lost almost all of it. A center that cannot move, a center that's immobile, is just like a piece that can't move. It's not very good. It's much worse than it could be. So this is the first aspect of the pawn center, is that right now, here it is very strong, but if it starts advancing, it can create weaknesses. And if it advances too early, it's ill-timed, then black's pieces can take advantage of those squares. And this is a related concept, if I just back up, is that every pawn move creates some weaknesses. For example, right here, if white plays, just e3, it's controlling these 2 squares. Every time the pawn advances, though, it's controlling more advanced squares, yes, but now these squares are slightly weaker. And then these squares are slightly weaker. And so the more the pawn advances, the more potential weakness it creates. And this is definitely true the more the pawns are advanced. So these pawns have advanced tremendously, so they've gained an incredible amount of space. They're controlling these squares. But look at all the weaknesses or potential weaknesses that are left behind. In particular, these e-file weaknesses are exceptionally weak because no pawns protect them at all. These squares, right, so g4, it is weak, but at any point h3 could defend it. But h3 would then make this square much weaker, right? So the more your pawns advance, the more weaknesses they create. And if black can get his pieces around these pawns, if black can get his pieces into these critical red squares, then often things become extremely difficult for white. Often black will get a decisive attack because white's advantage is his space. But if black's pieces are better, then white has no advantage at all. If we back up then, in a position like this, the general hypermodern strategy is right now these pawns are all strong because they're connected, they control all these squares. And so what black does, the idea, is he wants to either exchange or make a pawn advance, ideally prematurely, and then take advantage of either the squares in front of the pawns or the squares around and behind the pawns. That is the black idea. That's the black goal. And this will lead to one more principle, which I'll explain in a second. If we look here, this is going to look slightly ridiculous, but it's going to illustrate an important point, which is this, is that space equals time. In order for white to seize space, to gain space, it requires tempo. It requires several moves. So for example, if we look at this, white could play d5 here, which is gaining space, right? He now has more space than he did before. And he could play c4, c5. White is gaining all this space over here. At the cost, though, is that he has not moved any of his pieces, whereas after this, black now has his pieces and he's castled. Right? So black has an advantage in time. White has, yes, he's gained space, but he's lost it in time. And now, if we look at the following, what's going to happen is black counterattacks the center right away, and if white were to exchange, again, I know I'm not claiming this is best play. If he exchanges, look at what's happened. Black now has most of his minor pieces out, and what does white have to show? He's got a really advanced pawn, which is more of a weakness than anything. It can be attacked. He has an open d-file. Now, an open d-file could be very useful. However, his pieces aren't developed. He's in no position to use it. And so he's used a lot of time. Yes, he has space, but now starts the counterattack. So queen a5, hitting the weak pawn. White now needs to do something unnatural, like bishop e3, try to defend it. Knight e4, and we can see now that black has a huge lead in activity. He's got a major attack coming here on c3, the knight, the queen, the bishop. This knight could potentially jump to b4 or d4 in the future. The c5 pawn is being hit by several pieces. Black has castled, white hasn't. White is at least 3 moves away from castling, but he also has to deal with these threats. And so what's going to likely happen is that his king's going to be stuck in the center while it starts opening up, and black's pieces are dominating. So this is sort of the idea behind the hypermodern openings, is that it gives white space at the cost of time. And so then black is going to use his time, that lead in development, to hit back at the center, and then try and create an imbalance or an advantage that way. That is the hypermodern idea. Now, the most popular hypermodern opening is likely the King's Indian defense. So we have this position here, which often leads to a position something like this. If we just follow the main line, we'll get a position that resembles this, in which white has a space advantage, black's going to counterattack on the king side, white will usually counter on the queen side. The one thing, though, is that in this position the center is completely blocked. All these pawns are here. Action doesn't happen in the center. Action happens on the wings in general. Black will advance with f5, usually g5, and attack here, while white will do the same thing over here. Again, for this series, I want to look at the center, the importance of the center. And so instead of analyzing positions like this, in which the pawns become static, I want to look what happens when the center remains more fluid. Because in many ways, this shows the hypermodern ideas more, and it shows it better, because this position is strictly King's Indian, and this is not related to, for example, the Alekhine defense or the modern defense. other openings, which are hypermodern in nature. So I'm going to look at hypermodern in general, not just King's Indian. Now we're going to move on to look at some games that illustrate these principles in practice. I picked some nice short ones that hopefully illustrate what Black wants to do. So again, the general idea is he wants to provoke pawn movements, so we can use the space in front of the pawns. He wants to get his pieces behind those pawns into that area there, and he wants to use his time. He wants to use his time in the best way possible to take advantage of White's early pawn moves. So the first example, this here is Fogelman versus Sanguinetti. This is 1958. It's actually a Grunfeld, which has similar ideas. And this is actually one of the interesting things about this. First, notice how White wasted time moving that bishop to e5. Black then does something that looks somewhat curious, where he takes the pawn and he allows this position. And if you don't understand the hypermodern ideas, it's very easy to look at this and just say, holy cow, White's got an advantage, because he's got 2 pawns in the center, he's got 3 pieces developed, he's controlling everything, things look great. But then the counterattack starts. Knight c6, which is pressuring the bishop, pressuring the pawn. White goes all in. f4. g4. And so we see here, right away, the knight is jumping into the square that was weakened by the pawn. Now again, things look okay. Take, take. But now, if we just notice something, there's a threat. There's 2 threats, actually. This pawn is attacked twice, knight and queen, only defended once. And this knight also wants to jump into e3, where it's hitting the queen, it's hitting the pawn, and it'd be hitting the bishop. So in fact, White's position is quite loose. Notice again that his king is in the center. Black's king is safe over here. Even though his dark squared bishop was traded, usually you want to, if you're going to attack someone who's got a fianchetto, you want to exchange that bishop. White's managed to do that, but he's in no danger. He's not ready to follow up. Black is in no danger. White plays d5. So he's getting space. Just like we talked about. But yet now watch what happens in these next 2 moves. The knight jumps in, attacks the queen, attacks the bishop, and after this knight jumps in. And so what's happened is Black has gotten into those squares that have been weakened by all the pawn advances. Right? If none of these pawns had moved, well, obviously that's not realistic, these squares would be well protected. Because White has made, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawn moves in the first 11 moves, right? He's a little behind development, and now these knights are absolutely fantastic. Threatening. Knight c2, check, picking up a rook. The bishop is attacked. The g2 pawn's attacked. What happens? White's already in huge difficulty here. He plays king d2 in the game, and the idea is to stop the knight c2. Now it's not check. The rook can escape. Now, Black, he could take the g2 pawn, simply win a pawn, but he thinks his position's worth more. So he plays knight g4. Now he's threatening knight f2, taking the rook, because it'd be stuck in the corner. White retreats, bishop e2, then e5. This is excellent, because again, White's king is now permanently stuck in the center, and so Black is trying to open it up. After the exchange, coming in here, f takes e5. Black is temporarily down a pawn, but it doesn't matter. This bishop, this knight, right now is attacked. Black will play c5. Again, counterattacking the center. If White were to take it, just look at what's happened here. There's not much left of White's center. His pawns don't really control any more pieces. Sure, he's up some material, but his king is here. This knight can move anywhere with a discovered attack. Queen g5 could come, or a rook comes to the open file, and White is just in huge trouble. For example, a sample line would be queen g5. His king is forced to stay in the center. Rook comes in. what do you do as white? Maybe you try and block the open file with knight d5. Well, black can sacrifice it because he has such a huge lead in activity. And then after this, well, he's going to skewer the queen with a winning position. Right? Why'd this happen? Because black's pieces got inside the pawns, right? His king got stuck in the center. He was forced to make huge concessions. His pawns don't control anything. The black pieces are coming in. So in order to stop this queen g5 idea, white plays h4. But then after queen e7, rook e1, queen takes e5, we now see the second idea that we discussed, is that the queen is directly in front of these pawns. Now these pawns, if this pawn were back here on d4, maybe white has some chance of hanging on. Because it isn't, because it's here, all these dark squares are now weak. These pawns can't advance. They're simply stuck there. And the game doesn't last much longer. In fact, it's only a few more moves and then white resigns because black just pours in. White plays knight e2, b5. Attacking the queen. White accepts the pawn, but then after knight takes e2, rook takes e2, instead of just taking on e2 right away, instead you play the intermediate check. Queen takes b2, and then black actually just wins everything. And so that's why white resigned. So just to go back, if we were to look here and just look at it briefly, it looks as if white is doing fantastic. He's got a very impressive position. He has complete control of the center, and he essentially has equal development. The problem were the weak squares that black was able to get instantly, right? Because within 3 moves, we had, let's see, what? The knight comes into g4, okay? And then it comes into e3, even better, d4, and it was just all downhill for white from here on in. So this here is the first example of how the counterattack, the hypermodern center, white still has strong control of the center, but black was able to get around it, get through it, and then he was able to destroy the center, right? We had this e5 come in, the c5 comes in, and it's just, there's nothing left. And that was game. Fantastic, excellent game here from black. This second game is going to illustrate the same general ideas, in a different way, in a more complex way. This game was Santos Latasa versus Arribas Lopez, 2009. This time it's a King's Indian 4-pawns attack, which I think is fitting, because this is, I suppose, the maximum white can possibly achieve in the center. 4 pawn moves in the first 5, all his pawns are in the center. And if we just go through this a little bit quickly, e5. So black has to strike back in the center. After take d5, we see that by advancing this pawn, this square is now open, and that's exactly what happens. Black takes advantage. So we now has a knight on c5 and a pawn on this square. A queen or a knight can come to this square potentially, or we get hit back with c6. But just notice how black has coaxed white into moving this pawn and then taking advantage of the square. That's the general idea. Notice that, backing up, instead of playing d5, if you were to take on e5, then this square would still become open. So as soon as this pawn moves, regardless, these squares become available for black. And so then again, d5, knight c5. White defends his pawn. Then black plays a thematic move, a5. Otherwise, white may play b4 at a certain stage, kicking the knight away, gaining more space, and then black loses time because his knight has to move. So by playing a5, black counters that. Black secures that his piece is in the center. And this is important because, again, chess is played with pieces. And so if you have a good piece, you want to keep it there. We had castle, knight h5. Now black is looking at the second idea, is he wants to invade on the squares that have become weaker. And so he's thinking in particular, he wants to plop a knight there onto f4. Yes, it can be taken by the bishop, but if we'd imagine that, let's just put a random move here. If we imagine something like this happens, whoops, here we go. Yes, this pawn is weak and will probably be taken, but now this bishop is wide open on this beautiful squares. Look how all the dark squares here are very weak. And so this is a general idea. I'm not saying this is the best play, this exact idea, this exact moment, but this is the idea behind it. That's what black wants to go for when he played knight h5. White retreated, bishop c2. Both sides are finishing development. Bishop d7, bishop b3, protects, g3. Up until now, the game has been fairly equal. Well, that's all you can really say. Both sides are pursuing their ideas. White does have a space advantage. Black's pieces are trying to take advantage of the weak squares behind it. An important thing to realize, again, is that space is permanent. Time is temporary. And so if black were to squander his time advantage, if he were to play a whole bunch of random nothing moves, like he just started moving his king, or he moved his rook, then moved it again, or he just did random, right? He's losing his time. And that'll give white time to compensate, to then get his pieces fully developed, and then he'll exploit his space advantage. So time really is of the essence for black, which is why he struck out with f5 right away. After the exchange, take, white brought his bishop in to attack the queen, then he brought it back to e3. I'm thinking that white is the lower rated player. He's a 2100 versus almost 2400. So he may have been hoping for a draw, that black would come back and we would get a draw by repetition this way. Instead, black, being the high rated player, he played b6, protect his knight. Then after rook e1, e4. This is actually kind of an important moment. If we can look at this, both sides have pawns in the center now. Black has 2 pawns here, white has 2 pawns here. There's something to look at, though, something that's important. Black's pawns are mobile. He can move f4, you can play e4, and there's not much white can do to stop either of those. It's impossible to stop an e4 advance. In fact, black does it next move. But it's also f4 is coming, and he's got all these pieces that could help. Well, white only has a couple here that could try to defend. If you look at white, these pawns cannot advance very easily. It's not sure if playing d5, d6 does anything. And the c4 pawn is permanently blocked by the knight. Trying to kick the knight away with b4 is impossible. And if white ever tries to play a3, then black will counter by playing a4 and then take this pawn en passant. That's the general idea. Notice how all these pieces are helping to secure the a4 pawn. And so, in a real way, even though white's pawn is advanced to d5, it's the most furthest advanced pawn, that space advantage doesn't mean very little. If your pawns can't move, in particular, if you can't improve your center, you're likely not doing very well. Black can. And starting now, we see him take over the game. He plays e4. Yes, this does give up a square. But then it allows his pieces to use the squares behind it as well. Both sides continue. We finally take. Knight d4, queen e5. Already, we can see there's unpleasant pressure here on the g3 pawn. Possibly there's sacrifices. Possibly f4 is coming. In fact, that's what happens. White tries to go on the defensive. We had f4. He moves his king out of the way, but now here comes the sacrifice. Queen comes in. And it's game over in just a few more moves. I'm just going to go through it quickly. And it's going to be checkmate. Well, that happened fast. I want to back up here. Because if you look at it quickly, like I just showed you, this is my first thought. While I was looking through a database trying to find a game that showed black win in this particular way, I saw this game like, oh wow, black did really well. He started advancing his pawns, he improved his pieces, white never really had anything, and then all of a sudden, boom, tactics. It's game over. That's not the whole story. In fact, it's not even close. I want to back up here. F5. This is the start of black's play, and it's the right idea. However, it's interesting, this actually fails tactically. Because after takes, instead of playing bishop g5, if white weren't worried about getting a draw, and he would play knight h4, all of a sudden we see that the queen is attacking the knight, and we've got 1, 2, 3 pieces attacking this pawn. Black can't defend both of them, black's going to lose something. Just like that. Tactical mistake. Moving forward. Same thing here. Black has just played e4, attacking the knight, and white had an interesting possibility. He could have simply ignored it. Because if black tries to take the knight, well then he's going to take this knight, a discovered attack on the queen. Black's center is now in tatters. These pawns are very weak, likely to be captured, and white's pieces are starting to come alive. Look how this rook is now an open file. Before the rook wasn't doing very little. Perhaps moving d6 here makes more sense. Interesting. Possibilities. Moving forward. Now the game's stabilized. Now here, black now has quite a big advantage. And he could have cashed in by sacrificing right away. Knight takes g3. And then this attack is absolutely devastating. The queen's going to come over to h4. F4, f3 can come as well. And it's 2 pawns for the piece. This knight can jump in. Black has a very easy, very powerful attack. Black doesn't do this. Instead, he played queen e5. And then he still has a great attack coming in here. Look at that. Now he sacrifices. But then we get to this position, and, well, white plays king g1. When you look at it, queen h2, take. And is there anything for white? Sorry, for black? He's down a piece. Okay, I guess he can win this pawn. His attack's over. This pawn is weak. Does black have some compensation? Can he advance these pawns quickly? Maybe. Maybe not. It's certainly not what we had back here, where this sacrifice leads to... Whoops. Wow, I'm really good at this. Where this sacrifice leads to almost certain victory very, very quickly. This position, white probably has the most chance to playing for a win, because he's up a piece. And he's going to attack this pawn, for example, knight b5, win the pawn, and then just start pushing this d6 pawn. That is likely going to be his idea. Anyway, we go back. After he played king g1. F takes. He played queen h2. When, again, take king h1 and... What does black have? What can black do? Sure, white's stuck in the center. White's king is stuck in the corner, but black can't improve it anymore. Black has nothing. Going back, instead of playing the most obvious queen h2, black, he does have a winning position. He could have played g2. With the threat of first moving a rook over to the f file. And then we've got queen h1 is going to be mate. Just like that. If white tries to play, say, queen f4 here, so that way he can go back here and stop, well then now we have a new threat here, in which doesn't matter what white does. Let's say he plays this. Well, we've got queen f1, take, and then that's a discovered double checkmate, which is kind of pretty. The reason I want to go back and I want to show with you all of these errors, because there's a lot of them. And again, this is between a 2100 and someone just below 2400. So between a master and likely an international master, at the very least a FIDE master. All right. And they made a lot of mistakes in this game, a heck of a lot of mistakes. And this is because when you look at a position like this, okay, where one side has space, one side has time, we're doing things, it is incredibly complex. Hypermodernism is very, very, leads to incredibly complex positions, very difficult positions, where even experts and masters can make, well, I don't want to say routine blunders, right, but can make mistakes incredibly easy. Because the position is so imbalanced. This is the nature of hypermodernism. It's the reason it took so long for people to first understand, and it's the reason why so many beginners, intermediates, and advanced players do not play it well. I do not play these positions well. My rating on chess.com is 2100 for daily correspondence chess, and I am terrible at these King's Indian positions. I can understand them after the fact. I can look at it, I can figure it out. But when I'm playing, it's very, very difficult, and I mess up routinely. I've got like a 30% win rate with the King's Indian. It's tough. It's extremely tough. This is not for beginners. But these are the ideas behind it. And even though both sides made lots of mistakes, we can still see how the ideas flowed, right? How there was black. He tried to take advantage of those squares, and then he started pushing his own pawns. He then brings his pieces over, and now he's got an attack coming in here, right? The ideas are still there. Everything was still played well. It was just the execution was faulty on both sides. So there we go. That is part 2 on my series on the center. I'm not sure if there'll be a part 3. I guess that'll be up to you. If you have questions or comments, please leave them down below. If you liked it, well, like it, subscribe. That'd be awesome. I love talking about chess, and so again, if you have ideas you want to share, or you want to go more deeply into some of these ideas, I would love to hear it. Tell me what you'd like to see, and I'll see what I can do. So again, I'm SmithyQ from SmithyQ.com. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and bye for now.